Hello. Good evening, everybody. Dr. Matthews, take your seat. Welcome, welcome. We're so glad that you're here. I'm Lissa Frankel. I'm the president and CEO of the Charleston Gilliard Center, and I have the distinct pleasure with sitting with these two amazing gentlemen here to my left and introducing them and moderating a quick conversation with them before we head into our show about Robert Smalls. So just to start really quickly, I know that on the website we had advertised that Victoria Smalls would be here tonight. Unfortunately, she has had a family emergency, so she won't be able to join us. But we have wonderful guides here in Michael and Michael. So to start off, Michael Moore, many of you know him, is a proud South Carolinian with a rich family history rooted in activism and public service. His ancestors include Robert Smalls, who, as we all know, is a Civil War hero and a Reconstruction congressman. He also has a family member, Samuel Jones Bamfield, and Judge Harold Boulware, who litigated the Briggs versus Elliott case and served on the legal team that won Brown versus Board of Education. So it's quite a family history here. I can't even go into Michael's history, his professional history. He's worked for many businesses and organizations, including Fortune 500 companies, entrepreneurial ventures, and he was, at the very beginning, the head of the International African American Museum as well. So he has deep roots in this community, both in the business sector and in the nonprofit sector. He was recognized as Charleston Business Magazine's 50 Most Influential People. And he is currently a candidate for the U.S. House of Representatives from South Carolina's 1st Congressional District, which is Robert Smalls' district. So it's very exciting. Please welcome Michael Moore. Michael Allen is also a South Carolina native. He began his public career with the National Park Service in 1980 and served in multiple capacities with that organization, including being a central player in the establishment of the first and only African American National Heritage Area, which is called the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. And this is why Michael is going to be a wonderful guide for us in Victoria's absence, because of course she is the current executive director of that corridor, and she and Michael know each other well and were involved in that creation of that site. He's also been credited with one of the architects of the Reconstruction era historic park in Beaufort, South Carolina. And in December 2017, Michael retired from the National Park Service after 37.5 years of public service. So he's got quite a history with that organization and has earned numerous awards with his involvement, including the highest civilian award, the Order of the Palmetto, in 2019, the highest South Carolina civilian award. So to start us off, I thought we'd start with a quote that actually Michael includes in his bio. It was an apt quote to talk about Robert Smalls and talk about remembering history. And it starts with, "To understand the present and move towards the future, you must first know and accept your past." So Michael, I was hoping you could start us off with a little primer on Reconstruction, because I think it's one of the eras in our country's history that we don't know as much about. It isn't taught as widely in the schools, and you're a wealth of knowledge. We'd love to know more.
Well, first, I would like to say thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight. There's so many wonderful faces that I see in the audience that helped me along my journey over the last 4 decades. So if I never told you thank you, I want to tell you tonight, thank you, thank you, thank you. To understand Reconstruction and to put it in a context historically, culturally, and from a modern perspective, I first have to be able to say the word Reconstruction. And you may say, well, why would I put it in that type of context? Because unfortunately, today, as well, right after Reconstruction, there was a movement to erase it, to not to say it occurred, that it happened, that it was a valid part of our American experience, and for some, it was an uplifting part of our American experience. Next month in November represents the assault on what we call on Port Royal, and Hilton Head, and St. Helena, and Beaufort, when Union forces began the process to liberate at least parts of coastal South Carolina. And it's in that liberation, if you will, that the whole genre of Reconstruction was born. The U.S. military, missionaries, and others found themselves in this land populated by Gullah Geechee people, unsure of the language, unsure of the process, and unsure how to move forward. But in the togetherness of those missionaries, of those folks of the military, and of the Gullah Geechee people, Reconstruction was born. A rebirth. 1, the breaking of the shackles. 2, an opportunity to work together. And 3, somewhat the beginning of the promise that had been made, I guess, to those on this side of the Atlantic since 1776. So in short, Reconstruction is an opportunity to, 1, right the wrongs of slavery. 2, provide that citizenship and opportunity, people of African descent that had been neglected from them. And thirdly, an opportunity for the United States to look at itself in a way, to look at democracy without it being challenged, and to provide hope to all. And so when I think about Reconstruction, these are the benchmarks, and we are fortunate enough here in South Carolina to be the genesis of that movement in our American experience.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. Yeah, it really all happened here, didn't it? And so just basically the period called Reconstruction was from 1865 to 1877. What happened in 1877 that ended Reconstruction?
If I may, I guess I will take a point of license. If you go to any of the National Park Service documentation around the era of Reconstruction, we use 1865 all the way to 1898.
Okay.
And let me explain that part. In 1876, there was a very tumultuous, I guess you can say, election. Somehow, electoral colleges and not counting votes and violence, things that we don't think should be happening in our modern political situation, transpired with Tilden and Hayes. And in that compromise of 1877, 1876, basically the decision was made that what had been started in Reconstruction, what had been started in Hilton Head, now must come to an end, and come to an end because of the removal of federal troops throughout the South. The appearance and the presence of federal troops throughout the South provide a depth of stability, at least for the most part. Right. But also we know the removal of the federal troops also began the decade moving us toward to Jim Crow. And so for me, looking at Reconstruction today, I think about the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. Unfortunately, today, some folks in our great land of the United States have less regards for the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And now we're being told, or we're hearing on the airways, that they don't have any relevance to us today. They're not important to us today. But I do believe in the 14th Amendment, and especially Section 3, that says anyone that committed violence, insurrection, or came up against the authority of the United States should no longer hold public office. I'll leave that there.
Okay, it's Michael Moore. Maybe you can illuminate sort of some of the personal history that occurred during that era with Robert Smalls as your ancestor, living and very much part of Reconstruction.
Yeah, it is difficult to know quite where to start, but I think, you mentioned the Big Gun Shoot. You mentioned the Battle of Port Royal. I think that is a great place to start. Parenthetically, over the last, I don't know, decade or so, but for sure the last few years, Juneteenth has gotten lots of awareness. It's become a federal holiday, and I think that's appropriate. But if it's important to know about the last day that enslaved people learned of their freedom, I think learning about the first time that enslaved people experienced freedom in any meaningful numbers, I think that's equally important, and maybe even, one could argue, more important. And that's November of 1861 and the Battle of Port Royal, when the United States forces came down, all of the whites fled, leaving the enslaved people. They weren't literally free. They weren't legally free. They were still contraband of war, but effectively they were liberated. And so I think that's an extraordinarily important part of American history. I think about Robert Smalls and where I go from there with the Port Royal experiment. Robert was instrumental in getting Penn School founded in St. Helena, and my great-grandmother Elizabeth was on the planter on May 13th, 1862, was one of the first students at Penn School, and then ended up coming back and working there. I grew up hearing from my grandmother about, and of course it's Penn Center now, but hearing about Penn School and all the work that it did. That was the first school for formerly enslaved people in all of the Confederate South. And obviously just a very important place. Some people have said that Penn School is the most consequential site of African American history, period. Now, obviously one can argue that, but there are strong arguments that could be made, for that. I also think about all the ways that Robert Smalls fought for freedom, fought for the rights of others, fought for most of his life for all South Carolinians. I think about the legislation that he wrote in the late 1860s from Columbia and the State House there, creating the public school system, not just for black students, but for all students. The first free compulsory statewide public school system, certainly in South Carolina, but in America, and the impact that had. So I think there's lots of things. The one thing I will say is hard to imagine how Robert felt once all of the things that he had worked so hard for began to be dismantled. And him, effectively, well, I would say presiding, but he, was in that constitutional convention when, all of the rights, all of the privileges of mere citizenship, but were removed and stripped away from people of African descent. So I can only imagine he just must have been, crushed at that.
Well, we have a member of Robert's family on the stage, and so you've talked about hearing about his history your whole life. I'm wondering, Michael Allen, when did you first hear about Robert Smalls? Growing up in South Carolina, were you taught about Robert Smalls in the schools, or when did you hear about him?
Well, unfortunately, in my formative school years in Williamsburg County and King Street, Robert was not introduced to me. But I need to put a footnote there. For those who are native to the soil here, you all probably either know or don't know that one family, one person controlled the education of South Carolina's history. That's the Oliphant family. And that family wrote the book that we utilized and you all utilized for history. And so unfortunately, in my formative years in King Street, that was not presented to me. But thank God for HBCU. So at SC State University or college in the fall of 1978 is when I pretty much had my baptism, I guess, into the things I was not taught in King Street. And one of the books that is dear to my heart today is called Black Majority by Dr. Peter Wood, my friend now, because I met him many years later. And in it, like Mike said, knowing the history and the culture, living in it, but maybe not having a full understanding of it as I began to go through black majority and begin to read the words that Dr. Wood left there for me to know and to understand, that's when I saw myself, saw my history, saw my culture, and was introduced to transitional individuals like Robert Smalls. Ironically, his name and his exploits stuck with me. So once I began working for the National Park Service, I had an opportunity also, I guess, to interface with him and his name and his history. First, just doing an exhibit for Black History Month, of course, at Fort Moultrie, in which they had never done one before on Robert Smalls. And I had to convince him that we perhaps should do one, because Robert did pass by here on his way to freedom. So we cannot neglect him. And so that got me into the process of knowing him. Later on, I was able to work with the State Ports Authority and the U.S. military, and we were able to bring the Robert Smalls vessel here to Charleston at the Ports Authority, where folks was able to see it. Eventually, I worked with Mike and his mom and his family, and I'm proud to be a part of the team that have 2 markers in the city of Charleston, not far from where we're sitting here tonight, that recognize Robert Smalls' exploits. One by where Historic Charleston Foundation's office, I think it's 42 East Bay Street or whatever it is. And then the second one exists within Waterfront Park, where he came pick up with your great-grandmother. He didn't leave her behind. And so those are my 2 biggest intersections, I guess you can say, with Robert. But I would add one more thing, and I want to tie Robert with Reconstruction and with Penn School. As the Park Service had been asked, and the community had been asked in December of 2000, that Beaufort should be a place. It is warranted that a National Park Service site should be created in the Beaufort area to commemorate, to remember, and to honor the legacy of the era of Reconstruction. That was said to us by the outgoing Secretary of the Interior, Bruce Babbitt, and others. And so we began that journey, if you will, to build a new National Park Service site in Beaufort, all the way back in 2000. And I would say 2000 is a formative year for me. It was the year that we began the journey of building what will become the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. It was the year that we began the journey, what we know now as the International African American Museum. These are the things that I saw and experienced and were a part of 23 years ago. But what I want to bring about the Penn Center is that when the Park Service talked about establishing a park in Beaufort, as always, you have to read the fine print. There's always technicalities. And so it was the Park Service decision that they would use a law called the Antiquities Act of 1906. And the Antiquities Act of 1906 allows the president, not Congress, to establish a National Park Service. And yours truly was pretty much instructed or asked to go to Penn Center, to sit down with the executive director at that time and ask this question: would the Penn Center donate land and a building to the United States public to establish a new National Park Service site dedicated to Reconstruction? And I would say, Mike, that was probably one of the hardest days of my career. Who am I to have to drive to St. Helena as an African Gullah man, ask Historic Penn Center, would they consider donating land to the United States government, knowing the intersection of Gullah Geechee African American people, one, with the United States government, two, the whole issue of land use. But this mantle fell on my back. And so I sat down, I thought about Robert as one of the original establishment personnel of this location, and I said, this is what I've been sent here to do. I know all who was here before, but if this is too hard, I'll leave right now. I understand. And he said, no, Mike, I think we can work this out. I said, well, I don't want you to lose your job. You better talk to your board. And so, lo and behold, nearly 7 months later, I sat before the board and brought the same conversation to them, and I left. And within an hour, I got a call saying that they had, well, everyone had voted in favor and one person abstained. And that's how a portion of Penn Center was transitioned from their jurisdiction to your jurisdiction as citizens of the United States. And that got us moving forward with Reconstruction in Beaufort, which now encompasses Darrell Hall on the campus of Penn Center and the lands around it. They're what we call the main visitor center, if you will, in the old fire station in downtown Beaufort, across from the arsenal. The lands adjacent to where the Naval Hospital sits now, historic plantation there, where the first reading of the Emancipation Proclamation took place in South Carolina on January the 1st, 1863. And
wow.
Those are the component pieces of Reconstruction in Beaufort, 17 years later, done by executive hand before President Obama left the building.
It's fascinating, and I've been there, and it is really a wonderful place to go, and also the tour guides are really wonderful humans. So if any of you haven't been there, you should head down. It's just an hour and a half or an hour away. So how can we learn from this? I mean, I think it's really interesting to me that you talk about Oliphant and the South Carolina academic standards and history. I grew up in Boston, and I don't think we learned about Reconstruction in Boston either, and we didn't have the same author to our books. And I know that in Robert's time, he was extraordinarily famous. There are articles all over the country about this heroic escape on the Planter. How do we learn from that and make sure that we are inclusive about all sorts of histories for our kids?
Well, I think we, particularly in times now where there are people who are investing enormous energy to mute stories like this, I think we just have to be intentional. Those of us who care about the truth, who care about sort of broad and inclusive aspects of our American history, I think we have to be intentional and active in trying to preserve and protect this history. I don't have to tell that in front of all these Asala folks. They've been doing it for forever. But it's a challenge. You know, my Low Country ancestors got here probably the late 1780s, and I've had family here ever since. Both my parents, though, left because of segregation to go to school, and I too grew up outside of Boston. And I remember as a young middle schooler thinking, okay, you know, Paul Revere, one if by land, two if by sea, that's cool, but that's not Robert Smalls. Like, where's Robert Smalls in the history books?
Yeah.
And as I got older, just came to learn that history is much more complicated than what actually happened. It's who has the power to tell the stories. You talked about the family. So yeah, we have to be, I mean, one of the reasons why I felt so, I felt doing the work with the International African American Museum, one of the reasons why I feel so proud of the work that, you know, Dr. Matthews has done is because that is an institution that is elevating stories on the site where they happened that are just so consequential to our understanding of American history, not just African American history, American history. So, but it is troubling.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we hope all of us will continue doing the good work. Just to shift gears a little bit, because I know we only have a couple minutes left, and then I want to open it up for questions. So Robert was sort of intentionally referred to and recognized as a Gullah statesman. And I'd love to hear more about how the Gullah culture figured into his identity and, any stories you know about that.
Well, I'll start. I mean, it's not a coincidence that, Robert grew up in Beaufort, was a Gullah young man and learned all of the cultural aspects of the water, boats. That obviously played a part in his future. I don't think if he wasn't a part of the Gullah tradition, I'm not sure that he would have gravitated necessarily to the docks, to the work that he did, and would have had maybe the sense about himself, the skills to gravitate to become the pilot of the planter, and then to have the confidence, the audacity, frankly, to seize opportunity and to take that ship and sail it to freedom. So I think his identity was a central part of, certainly, of his liberation. And it is said that politically, the fact that he was bicultural, could code switch, and could, when he was amongst his Gullah kinsmen, he could speak and understood that culture, but because he grew up in and around the house of his master, he spoke very good sort of English, and he could communicate that way. I think that was a key aspect of his political, success as well. So, I don't know, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I think looking at Robert and others and the whole corridor, it's the Africanism that's the DNA and the source of the strength, the tenacity, and the efforts that were placed by them. And I think they were blessed, they all were, and we are today, blessed in a unique way where when you are confident in yourself, first of all, and you know your history and your story, it elevates you in a way that you can walk in your truth and in your value. I'll make it personal. At the beginning of my Park Service journey, those attributes I just highlighted, I really didn't see them, really didn't know them, really didn't understand them. I was just doing a work, so to speak. But as time progressed, and really through the inkling of my wife, she began to share, because she's Gullah from James Island, and say, this is a calling that you're walking in. You have a responsibility that you have to carry out. And then you have a mantle that's upon you. I think that's the same way we have to look at Robert. The uniqueness of his birth, the challenges that brought, where he was raised, the effect that he was exiled, if you will, here to Charleston. But being exiled here to Charleston, or being sent here to Charleston, didn't deter his altitude. He took advantage of what was around him. He was able to use those skills and ability and to navigate not only the streets of Charleston, Columbia, but also within the White House, within our nation's story. And so I think it's pleasant that we are here tonight, one, having this conversation about him, and secondly, in a few moments once we finish here, to see in this edifice a play, a production about his life, legacy, history, and story. Now, set that on the shelf. But on this shelf, today in 2023, people would have us believe that what's over here is not valid, is not necessary, is not important. And so I think our job, I know at least Mike and our job is to quote, not be afraid, to speak what we know to be true, but to do it in a way to encourage you and to push you and to ask of you, for you to stand up and help us in this quest. Because I think the days ahead of us, we would need all of your voices. I'm supposed to be retired. Just as simple as that. And I say that in jest, but I know that's not a reality. And as long as I'm breathing, then I will be talking. And so I just need others to join Mike and I in this quest as we tell these transitional stories of our American experience. And at the end of the day, our democracy is being questioned. That's the bottom line.
Well, we're happy to be joining with you to tell the story of Robert Smalls on the stage tonight. Michael Moore, I know you saw the show this afternoon with a sold-out show of students from our schools, which was quite the energy. Can you tell us a couple of things about Robert that the folks won't see tonight? Because there are so many accomplishments that he achieved, and we couldn't fit them all in.
Yeah, that's a difficult question. So a couple quickly, I will say without giving anything away that you'll see, but a couple of the really important things that struck me that were included. I think Robert did a lot of things in his life. There were a lot of aspects about his character and who he was, but at the core, he was a husband, he was a father, and he loved his family. And I believe that that was the core motivation that was behind him seizing his freedom. He knew that as an enslaved person, you know, his family could be separated from him just like that. And I think that was the spark. And I got that from this, and I think that's important. The other thing is, there's much more information about Robert than the people surrounding Robert. And so I've grown up hearing lots of stories from my grandmother and her siblings about the man, about Grandpa. But I didn't hear so much about Hannah, his wife. I didn't hear so much about Lydia, his mother. And so for me, seeing interpretations, expressions of my great-great-grandmother, of my great-great-great-grandmother. Lydia was born in 1796. You know, she gave birth to Robert on the floor of her, little shed when she was 45 years old by herself. So I think about her strength. I think about just the stuff that she must have been made of and given to Robert to sort of help him through, his life and everything. And so I think that's important. But Robert, accomplished so much. He came back. You all know the general story. Likely, he was on the Planters, sailed that to freedom. He actually came back and fought in the war effort. He became the first African American to command a United States naval vessel on that ship, the Planter. Fought in 17 battles. After the war, he ran for school board, which many people don't know, but then he was elected to the South Carolina House, and then in 1868, and then into the Senate, and then 5 terms, in Congress in Washington. Most of you know that he wrote the legislation to create the public school system. When he was in Congress, he sort of brought home the bacon to create Parris Island, which is still there to this day. He was a major general in the South Carolina militia, which I guess is akin to the National Guard. He founded the Republican Party, which I just feel compelled to say was the progressive party of Lincoln at the time. He, even after, I think, a testament to his stature and to all that he did to contribute to building this state and this country, he was named by the president to be the collector of customs, which at the time was a rather, serious, consequential kind of a position. And he lived the rest of his life, died in 1915 there. So he was just a man who came along at a time when there was lots to be done, and he had the Constitution, let's say, to roll up his sleeves and to make things happen. And I couldn't be prouder of all the things that he did.
That's wonderful. Well, I feel like this is a perfect time to open up to questions from the audience. If any of y'all have any questions about Robert or the Reconstruction era or anything about this history, we'd love to hear them. Yes, sir.
You've talked about such an incredible body of work. If he were able to come back from the grave tonight and stand right up at that podium, what would he say to us that would allow us to be inspired and to leave here better people than we came?
Well, I think he might remind us of perhaps his most famous quote that was given at a time when, again, the institution, the equality, Reconstruction was sort of dissolving. He said, "My race needs no special defense, for the past history of them in this country proves them to be the equal of anyone, anywhere. All they need is an equal chance in the battle of life." And I think he would be deeply disturbed by so much that he saw. I think he would be, and I'm going to try to be really brief here. I think he would be really concerned about the state of public education. He was denied education as a young person. I think that's why, the first thing he did when he got a reward for delivering the planet to the United States is he went out and he paid for tutors, one in the morning, one at night, to teach him how to learn how to read and write, because that was, kept from him as a youngster. I think in South Carolina, I think we can do better, and I think he would probably acknowledge that. I think he would likely say, next Wednesday, the Supreme Court will hear oral arguments about the redistricting of the 1st Congressional District. Some of you may know that Robert was gerrymandered out of a district. He started in one district, and they gerrymandered that district to remove some of the African-American presence there and create safer white districts. And I think he would look at what was happening in the 1st Congressional District and say, okay, different time, different place. The Democrats then are now Republicans, the Republicans then are now Democrats, but similar tools for similar kind of pernicious objectives. And I think that would, disturb him. I think he fought for all people. I think he would be deeply concerned about the way that our country is dividing over so many different things. I think he would talk to us about those common, elements.
And I would say if he was standing there as you asked, sir, I think he would commend you all here at the Gilliard for the work that you are doing now to bring education into the lives of a young generation. In my days of working with the National Park Service, part of my responsibility in some of those days was specifically with kids, students, and with teachers. And as Mike said, our whole educational system now is challenged. Some of it is challenged because of the times that we lived in, and some of it is also repetitive. The fact now that some parts of our nation, Texas, many schools in Houston, don't even have a library where you can even go and sit just to read about Robert Smalls. They've been turned into other things. Other parts of our nation, as Mike talked about, education, where you could potentially have a conversation in your classroom about Robert Smalls, about Harriet Tubman, about the 54th. But perhaps if you were in a high school in Florida, that might be problematic. These are not things that we are making up. These are things that are in our face. And so I think he would tell us to fight on, speak up and speak out against these things.
And not to be flippant, but I think this is a really consequential evening. It's a very, very special performance that you're all about to see. And, I think Robert is there. He's here. He's with us. He's here.
Anybody else want to ask a question? She's coming with the mic for you. Oh, sorry.
Thank you so much. There's one story, and I do not know if it's in the play tonight, but it speaks to the heart of the person, and that is that after all was said and done, he was able to buy the home that he was enslaved in, that when the mistress came back, he allowed her to stay there the rest of his life. Can you share that with the audience?
Yeah, I think it's a powerful testament to, you know, the man and his character and his sense of humanity. So again, Robert got this big reward. He didn't get, by the way, what the government prescribed for delivering those kinds of assets. I guess Congress couldn't see fit to give a black man that much money, but he got a very nice reward. And with that, one of the main things he did was he bought the former big house that he had been enslaved, he and his mother had been enslaved at. And sort of after the war, as folks were coming back down to the Low Country, as the story goes, his former master's wife came back to the house, Jane Bold McKee. And Mr. McKee had passed. She was both mentally and physically ill, came back thinking she was coming back home. And Robert I think he could have dealt with that situation in a number of different ways. Even charitably, he could have said, okay, you know what, this isn't your home anymore, but I'm going to take you over here and let these folks take care of you. But he embraced her. He brought her in. He and Hannah and Lydia, they, you know, cared for her. She ended up staying in the master bedroom. They sort of created a situation where she believed she was still the woman of the house. She wouldn't eat at the dining room table with them, but as the story goes, and cared for her for the rest of her life. And so I often, you know, challenge myself, like, would I have done that? Could I have done that? You know, this woman, you know, again, just a few years ago, considered him a piece of chattel, just a beast of burden. And Robert had the resolve, the sense of humanity to bring her in and care for her. And I think that speaks to his, just so much about his character.
Yes, thank you for asking that question. And I think it helps us try to think about reconciliation too, you know, in a day like today. I know there was a question from a woman up here on the front, and then I think we might need to end it because we have a show to go to.
Thank you. What are some strategies or suggestions on how we make Robert Smalls a national conversation? This is not a South Carolina conversation, but how do we make this national figure a conversation nationally? I too am a product of the soil of South Carolina, but Robert Smalls is not just the soil of South Carolina. This is a national conversation, and all of the accomplishments, public education and all that has been mentioned. What are some strategies that we can tell this story nationally?
I'll start quickly and then I'll pass it to you. So
I have something to say too, so we'll all talk.
So one of the things is, and I want to talk really quickly about an accomplishment that we didn't mention today. Robert was taken to Washington, D.C. and met with President Lincoln and Secretary of War Stanton. And in that meeting, he convinced the president to allow formerly enslaved men, African-American men, into the war effort. That brought in about 180,000, 200,000 men. And there are some historians who believe that without that contribution of resources, of energy, of men to the United States war effort, the United States might not prevail. And so our country might be very, very different right now. So I agree, this is a national story. I couldn't be more biased about this, by the way. But I think, you know, there are more things that are coming out. I think what the Gilliard is doing is an amazing testament to this. Who knows, there may be other opportunities to share this work. Really quickly, I'll tell you a couple of quick projects. There is a graphic novel and a movie project that I'm involved with via a company called Legion M, with Bill Duke, the producer, with the writer, a Disney original writer from The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air and In Living Color, who's done amazing things, who has written an amazing script. The graphic novel is coming out in the spring, and then the movie or Netflix series will follow. I've got a illustrated children's book that's coming out in the spring that is with probably the preeminent African-American illustrator, Brian Collier. That's going to be a really special book. So I think things are slowly but surely getting out, and certainly this is a great platform to do that.
And I would just say, I think, you know, the park site that has been established in Beaufort is another wonderful vehicle to do that. And I'll say this quickly. I told you all the component pieces of the park. I still kick myself today because I didn't get on the phone. I didn't call Mike and say, Mike, let's drive to Beaufort and talk to the owner of the Robert Smalls house. Because when we were building the park, we wanted that to be within the jurisdiction, within the boundaries. But the owner of the property waffled. He was nervous. The Secretary of Interior called him, he clicked. The head of the Park Service called him, click. The regional director in Atlanta called him, click. And I said, Mike, we should do this, but I let a faint heart get in the way. So I owe you an apology, Mike, that I didn't call you up and we could have driven to his home, sat in that house, and it would potentially today be a part of the boundary of the Park Service. But be that as it may, it's in a better place today for you. So I think that the park that's there, that's telling this story, first of all, that we can publicly say the word, what? Reconstruction at a National Park Service site gives us the breadth and the scope to also help to elevate, as you asked, Robert Smalls' name, legacy, and his contributions to our American experience.
And I will just add to that I know that the former mayor of Beaufort, Billy Kaiserling, and his brother did purchase the house, yes. And they are coming tonight, and I think that's their vision to open the house up to the public too, and there's some hurdles to that, so if you want to get involved with that, you should look into it and raise your voice. But from our part, from the Gilliard's part, I will say we do have ambitions to tour this show, so if you like it, please, continue to follow us. And we are doing a feasibility study this year to see if we can tour it to other cultural institutions around the country and around the region as well. So we have sort of two tours, one that will be sort of a regional Southern tour because we think it's urgent that the rest of the South really know this story. But as you said, it feels like it's really a national story. We hope you love the show. And we think it really has legs to be toured around the country. So we're hopeful for that too. Okay, I think we're done with time. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to my guests. We appreciate you. It's been really fascinating and wonderful. We look forward to seeing you next tour.